On the morning of August 12, 1843, just as the first pale light crept over the marshes, a single scream tore through the stillness of Willowbrook Plantation. It wasn't the sharp cry of someone startled. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of a soul realizing that the life it thought it was living had never truly existed. Servants froze where they stood. A pot slipped from a cook's hands and shattered on the kitchen floor. Stable boys looked up from their work. In the great house, doors opened a crack, then quickly shut again, because the scream had come from only one place it could have come from, the master's private quarters. Inside that house, Catherine Hargrove, 28 years old, impeccably dressed, perfectly mannered, had just seen something in her husband's east wing that would set an entire county on fire. But before we go back to that locked door and the horror behind it, you need to understand the world that made what happened next not only possible, but inevitable. Because what happened at Willowbrook wasn't just about one man's secret. It was about a society built so carefully on reputation that when someone cracked its surface, everyone demanded blood to seal it back together. And if this story is already giving you chills, remember this really happened. The newspapers refused to print the details for 60 years. The county sealed the records until 1923, and when historians finally opened those files, they realized the rumors had been merciful. The truth was worse, much worse. Now let me take you back. In the early 1840s, Bowford, South Carolina was a place of beautiful lies. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like funeral veils, soft and ghostly. The air smelled of magnolia and salt marsh, a sweetness that could never fully cover the rot underneath. White columned mansions lined the roads, each one trying to outdo the others in size, in shine, in reminders of how much money its owner could command. That money came from the same place everywhere. Fields worked from before sunrise to after dark by enslaved hands. Men, women, and children whose names were written in ledgers like furniture. Bowford's polite society called this order God's will, the natural way of things. And at the very top of that order stood the Hargrove family. Willowbrook Plantation was their kingdom. 3,000 acres of prime land, a Greek revival house completed in 1838 that people whispered about in town. Crystal chandeliers from France, heart pine floors joined so perfectly you could run your fingers across them and never feel a seam. Guests left in awe, telling each other that no one did it like Edmund Hargrove. Edmund was 35 in 1843. Tall, broad-shouldered from years in the saddle, dark hair, a controlled, measured way of speaking that said old money and unquestioned authority. He sat on the town council. He was a deacon at church. He was known as a fair master, which in that time only meant he didn't whip as often or as visibly as some of his neighbors. Outwardly, Edmund was everything Bowford believed a gentleman should be. Inwardly, he was carrying a secret that would not only destroy him, but take 3 other men with him to the grave. Catherine Peton became Catherine Hargrove in 1837. She came from Charleston money, real money. Old rice, old trade, old names. Her marriage to Edmund was arranged like so many others of their Class II powerful families, stitching their fortunes together through a ceremony, a ring, and a promise no one really asked them about. Catherine was exactly what her world demanded. Pale skin protected from the sun, dark hair pinned and arranged into careful perfection, a waist pulled into a fashionable, dizzying narrowness by corsets that taught girls to breathe small and move quietly. She played piano. She painted watercolors. She spoke French well enough to impress guests. She had been trained in the art her society valued most in women, running an entire household while pretending to do almost nothing at all. Their wedding at St. Michael's Church drew 400 guests. People still talked about the flowers, the food, the carriages lined up outside. Everyone agreed they were a perfect match. Everyone assumed their children would be beautiful. But 6 years later, there were no children. In parlors and sewing rooms, women whispered about that, always gently, always coated in pity so thin you could see the judgment underneath. In their world, a wife who did not produce an heir was a failure, no matter how gracious her manners or how perfect her embroidery. Catherine felt those whispers. even when she couldn't hear the words. She saw the way Edmund's mother's mouth tightened when someone mentioned babies. She saw how conversations shifted when she entered the room. With every passing year, her value shrank in other people's eyes, reduced to the question no one dared ask her directly. Why hasn't she given him a child? What Catherine did not understand was the answer to that question was not in her body. It was in the quarters behind the main house. The truth had names: Marcus, Samuel, Daniel Marcus 24, son of the plantation's head cook. Light, skinned with features that hinted at ancestry no one in Bowford would acknowledge out loud. He had moved into the main house at 15 as a footman, then risen to the role of Edmund's personal valet. Intelligent, observant, he had learned to move like a shadow, always at the right place, never fully seen. Samuel, 26, worked the stables. He was darker than Marcus, his body built by hard labor and long days. His hands were steady on a horse's reins, on leather he repaired, on tools he used. There was a quiet strength in him, a dignity slavery tried but never quite managed to erase. Edmund had started noticing Samuel 3 years earlier. The visits to the stables had grown more frequent after that. Daniel was 21, the plantation's carpenter. Slim with long, precise fingers and an eye for detail that made his work seem almost delicate. He spoke rarely and softly when he did. He had learned young that invisible men survived longer. These 3 men had more in common than their age and the same overseer. They shared a secret room with their master. Edmund had been careful, very careful. He used the east wing of the house, a section supposedly under renovation, closed off, avoided. There he created a hidden world, a room with its own entrance from the gardens, a lock on the door, heavy curtains, a wide bed dressed in the finest linens, oil lamps that softened every edge. For 3 years this room was his escape. Sometimes Marcus came alone, sometimes Samuel, sometimes Daniel, and sometimes, when the risk seemed manageable and the house was especially still, more than one of them. They were property. They had no choice. When Edmund sent word, they came. It didn't matter what they really felt. Fear, disgust, tenderness, desire, or some tangled mixture of all of it. Survival meant obedience. Refusing the master meant beating sail, being torn from family and sent who knew where. So they kept his secret because keeping it kept them alive. And day after day, Edmund walked back into his role as gentleman, husband, deacon, master, his double life balanced on silence and terror. But a plantation is a breathing, listening organism. Nothing stays hidden forever in a house full of doors, thin walls, and people trained to notice the smallest change in a master's moods. Catherine began to see things, first as flashes, then as patterns. The east wing door, always locked, fine linens marked in her inventory, suddenly misplaced, never found. Edmund, drawn and dark for weeks, then suddenly energized, lighter for no obvious reason. Samuel appearing in the garden late at night, when he should have been in the quarters, eyes flicking toward the east wing and away again. Marcus moving through the rooms with a tension in his shoulders, gaze slipping past Catherine's face, as if he were afraid to meet her eyes for too long. Daniel with faint bruises on his neck, marks that could have been from hands, from lips. When asked, he mumbled something about a fall, a beam, an accident that didn't quite ring true. She noticed. She told herself she was being foolish, because the alternative, that her husband, a respected South Carolina planter, was committing acts the law called an abomination, was unthinkable. In that time, the word sodomy was barely spoken even in private. It meant a crime so terrible that just naming it felt dangerous. The punishment on the books was death. The punishment off the books in gossip and social exile was sometimes worse. No gentleman would do such a thing, she told herself. And yet, Catherine had not grown up knave. Southern women were expected to look delicate, but they were trained from girlhood to read men, to hear secrets in what was not said, to survive in houses where power never fully belonged to them. 6 years of a distant husband, a cold marriage bed, and the sting of whispers about her failure had sharpened her perception, not dulled it. The more she tried to ignore what she saw, the more the truth pressed in around her, like damp seeping through the walls. On the night of August 11th, 1843, something inside Catherine snapped into place. She no longer wanted to guess. She wanted to know. She waited that night as the house wound down, as candles were snuffed and footsteps faded. She lay in her bed, eyes open, listening to every creak, every murmur, until she heard the sound she had come to recognize without ever admitting it to herself. Edmund's tread in the corridor, moving past her door, turning toward the servant's stair, then the slower creak of those narrow steps as he descended out of sight. She counted her breaths. 10 minutes. Enough time for him to cross the dark garden paths, unlock the east wing door, and feel safe. Only then did she rise. She didn't bother with full clothing. Just her white nightgown and a dark shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her bare feet were silent on the polished floors as she slipped through the house, through the back door, and into the heavy summer air. Outside, the plantation slept. The cicadas sang. A thin quarter moon hovered over the marsh, giving just enough light to turn the garden paths into grey ribbons. The faint glow of the slave quarters flickered in the distance. Catherine moved toward the east wing, heart pounding so hard it seemed impossible that no one else could hear it. As she drew closer, she saw it, the side door, not fully closed, a thin line of light spilling out into the night. She paused, swallowed, and stepped up to the edge of that door. One more step and everything she thought she knew about her life would shatter. With shaking fingers, Catherine pushed the door open a fraction and looked inside. And what she saw in that hidden room, her husband's body intertwined with the bodies of 3 enslaved men he owned, would not only launch the scream that shattered Willowbrook at dawn, but set in motion a punishment so brutal that the county would lock every record of it away for 80 years. The room was not what Catherine expected. She had imagined something crude, hastily arranged. Instead, the east wing chamber looked like a private parlor someone had taken care to make comfortable. The bed was wide and generously padded, covered in fine linens she recognized as missing from her household inventory. Oil lamps glowed on the side tables, their light soft and flattering, turning skin into warm gold and hiding flaws in shadows. This was not a mistake. It was a sanctuary, her husband's sanctuary. Edmund was on the bed, completely unclothed, his body tangled with the bodies of 3 other men, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel. Their movements left no space for misunderstanding. The intimacy between them was practiced, familiar. This wasn't awkward or tentative. It was something that had been done many times before in that same room, under that same lamplight. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. The scream that rose in her throat stopped behind her fingers, choking her. She watched Edmund kiss Marcus with a tenderness he had never shown her. She watched Samuel's hands move across Edmund's back, as if they knew every ridge of every muscle. She saw Daniel lean in and whisper something that made Edmund laugh. A real, unguarded laugh she hadn't heard in years. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but for Catherine those seconds stretched into something endless and shattering. In 1843, South Carolina, what she was seeing was more than personal betrayal. It was a crime that carried the possibility of death. The law didn't care who felt what. It didn't care that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were slaves who could not refuse their master. It didn't care about desire, loneliness, or the strange, complicated truths of human attachment. The law had one word for its sodomy. The churches had another abomination. Catherine's mind tried to reject what her eyes were telling her. Edmund Hargrove was a planter, a deacon, a man people trusted with their daughters' futures and their sons' careers. He was supposed to be the anchor of her life, the name that protected hers. Yet here he was in a secret room, living a life with 3 enslaved men that seemed to hold more warmth, more feeling, more honesty than he had ever shown his wife. Something inside her turned to ice. The humiliation cut deepest first. 6 years of whispers about her empty cradle. 6 years of thinking something was wrong with her. 6 years of wondering why Edmund avoided her bed, why his touch was mechanical when it came at all. Now the truth burned in front of her. It was never about her. He had never been absent from the marriage bed because he lacked passion. He had simply taken that passion elsewhere, to men who weren't allowed to say no. Catherine eased away from the door, one small step at a time, afraid that any sound might break the spell and send Edmund looking for the source. When she reached the garden shadow, she turned and walked quickly, almost calmly, back toward the main house. The night air pressed against her lungs. Her heart was still racing, but her hands, she noticed, had stopped shaking. By the time she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, something else had taken hold of her. Not just grief, not just shame, rage. Not the wild, uncontrolled kind that makes a person scream and throw things. This was colder, sharper, a rage that thought in straight lines and understood exactly how much power a story could have in a place like Bowford. She closed her door, lit a candle, and sat down at her writing desk. Then she pulled out paper and began to write. Catherine wrote 3 letters. The first was to Edmund's mother. She described, not in lurid terms but with careful, undeniable clarity, what she had seen. She laid out the facts of the room, the men, the acts. She did not spare the details necessary to make it impossible for anyone to claim she had misunderstood. The second letter was to Sheriff Charles Dunor. She wrote as a wronged wife, as a citizen, as a woman invoking the law to punish a crime so serious she could barely bring herself to name it. She again recorded what she had witnessed, the location of the room, the presence of the enslaved men. The third letter was to Edmund himself. This one was shorter. She told him that she knew everything, that by the time he read her words, the sheriff would already be on his way, that she would not protect him, that whatever mask he had worn in Bowford was about to be shattered for everyone to see. She signed each letter with a steady hand. Then she walked down the hallway, still in her nightgown, and slid Edmund's letter under his door. After that, she returned to her bed. She did not sleep. She lay there fully dressed, staring into the darkness, listening for the moment her world would officially begin to come apart. Edmund found the letter at dawn. He had returned from the East Wing in the small hours of the morning, exhausted but strangely content in the fragile way he had grown used to. He had slept badly, haunted by the constant fear of discovery that never fully left him. The folded paper on the floor in front of his door seemed innocent at first. He picked it up, recognized Catherine's hand, and felt his stomach drop. By the time he finished the first reading, his face had gone pale. By the third, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the page still. Catherine had seen him. She knew about the room. She knew about Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, and worst of all, she had already written to the sheriff. His first thought was to run, to saddle a horse, ride north, vanish into some nameless town where no one knew the Hargrove name. But the fantasy collapsed almost as soon as it formed. His entire life was tied to Willowbrook. He had no trade, no profession outside this world. Without his plantation, without his status, what was he? His second instinct was denial. Could he convince Catherine she'd misunderstood? That she had walked in at a strange angle? That what she'd seen was something else? Something less damning? But the letter left no room for that. She had described too much. The bed, the linens, the way he had touched them, the way they had touched him. His third instinct was anger. How dare she betray him? How dare she, of all people, expose him to the law? But even as he felt that flare of rage, he knew it was hollow. She was not the one who had created this situation. She was reacting to the lie he had built their marriage on. In the rigid world they lived in, she was doing exactly what everyone would say a virtuous wife should do. The man who had destroyed his life was the same one staring back at him in the mirror. He walked to Catherine's door and knocked. "Catherine, we must talk, please." The handle did not move. Her voice came through the wood, calm and flat, as if she were ordering breakfast instead of ending his world. "There is nothing to discuss, Edmund. The letters have been sent. Sheriff Dunor will arrive within the hour. Your mother shortly after. I suggest you use whatever time remains to make peace with God. You will find no peace among men." "Please," Edmund whispered, pressing his forehead to the door. Catherine, I can explain. Explain what? She cut in, her tone suddenly sharp. That for 3 years you have defiled yourself and the men you own. That you have turned our marriage into a lie and our house into a theater for your secret appetites. There is no explanation that changes what you are. You are a sodomite, Edmund. That is what you will be in Bowford by sunset, and nothing else. Her footsteps retreated. The conversation was over. For the first time since he was a child, Edmund Hargrove felt truly afraid. Sheriff Charles Dunor arrived at Willowbrook around 7:30 that morning. He was a large man in his 60s, with a grey beard and the kind of tired eyes that had seen more violence than most people ever would. He had watched boys become men, men become criminals, criminals become corpses. He had also watched Edmund Hargrove grow from a serious, proud child into one of the most powerful landowners in the county. Catherine met him at the door. She was still in nightclothes, but she had thrown a dark wrapper over them and pinned her hair. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady when she offered the sheriff and his deputies coffee and invited them to sit. She told the story as if she were giving testimony already, ordered, precise, almost detached. The sheriff listened, jaw gradually tightening. When she handed him the letter she had copied for him, he read it slowly, lips pressing into a hard line. "These are serious charges, Mrs. Hargrove," he said at last. "The most serious a man can face in this state. I am aware, Sheriff. That is why I sent for you immediately," she replied. "My husband is in his study. The 3 slaves involved are in the quarters. I want them all arrested. I want the law to do what it was made to do." He asked to see the room. Catherine led them through the house to the east wing, to the side door she had used in the night. The lamps had burned low, but the evidence was still there. The unmade bed, the linens, the smell of sweat and oil, the arrangement of the furniture. The sheriff looked at all of it, and whatever doubt he might have clung to drained away. "Arrest Mr. Hargrove," he told his deputies quietly. "Bring him to town jail. Then go to the quarters and bring Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel in chains." They found Edmund in his study. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not argue. When the deputies entered, he stood slowly, set down the glass he'd been staring into, and held out his wrists. His face was blank, hollow. In the hallway, Catherine watched him pass. Their eyes met for the first time since the night before. "I hope you understand what you've done," Edmund said softly, voice ragged. "This will destroy you as surely as it destroys me." Catherine gave him a small, cold smile. "No, Edmund. I understand exactly what I've done. I have revealed you. That is all. I will go back to Charleston as the wronged wife. They will receive me as a victim. You will be a story, a warning, a whisper about what happens to men who live as you chose to live. You are the only one who is truly destroyed." The deputies led him outside, shackles heavy on his wrists, to a waiting wagon. The fall from master of Willowbrook to prisoner in chains happened in a few minutes. It felt, to everyone who saw it, like watching a statue pushed off its pedestal. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken from the quarters next. Their families watched silently as the deputies clamped irons around their wrists and ankles. They knew what it meant to see someone taken away like that. For enslaved people, accusations did not lead to trials that might be won. They led almost always to punishment and death. No one asked the 3 men what had really happened. No one asked if they had ever been given a choice. By noon, all 4 men were locked in separate cells in the Bowford jail. By sunset, the scandal had spread through every corner of town. In shops and parlors, people leaned close and whispered. House servants carried the news home. Men repeated it at the tavern with lowered voices and stolen glances. Edmund Hargrove, with 3 male slaves. In a secret room, his wife had caught him. His wife had turned him in. The shock was so great that for a brief moment, Bowford forgot its usual small quarrels, its gossip about crops and dresses and marriages. Every conversation bent toward one single question: what would be done with a man like Edmund Hargrove and the 3 enslaved men who shared his secret? By the end of that first day, one thing was already certain. Whatever happened next would not be quiet. and it would not be merciful. The week that followed Edmund's arrest felt unnatural, as if the air itself had thickened. Bowford was used to scandal, affairs, debts, fights, broken engagements, but nothing had ever shaken the town like this. This was not a story whispered behind fans. This was the kind of sin that made men lock their doors and women clutch their children tighter. Because if someone like Edmund Hargrove could fall this far, anyone could, and everyone waited for the court to decide how far he would be made to fall. Judge Howard Middleton was 68 years old, a veteran of the War of 1812, and a man known throughout the Low Country for his strict interpretation of law. He had watched Bowford grow from a cluster of farms to a wealthy plantation town. He knew every founding family, every old rivalry, every secret that wasn't quite a secret, but wasn't spoken aloud either. He also knew Edmund Hargrove's father, and had watched Edmund himself grow from a proud, difficult boy into a respected landowner. When the sheriff placed the arrest documents on his desk, Judge Middleton sat in silence for a long time. He read Catherine's letter first, then the sheriff's report, then the witnesses' statements. Each detail tightened something inside him, a slow constriction like a rope pulling through a pulley. Finally, he set the papers down and closed his eyes. The law was painfully clear. South Carolina's statutes on sodomy allowed for only two punishments: death, or something worse. Judge Middleton knew one other thing, something the crowd outside had not yet considered. If a wealthy white man could escape punishment for this crime, the entire social order would tremble. If slaves could be seen as equal participants, that order might collapse entirely. The judge called a private meeting. Aram of men decided. They met 2 days after the arrest. The sheriff, the county prosecutor, the mayor, 2 church deacons, and a few of Bowford's wealthiest citizens. Not one woman was allowed inside, not even Catherine, whose life had detonated the whole event. Judge Middleton stood at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "we face a matter of unprecedented gravity." They all knew that was an understatement. What followed was a polite but vicious argument masked behind soft tones and carefully chosen words. The mayor spoke first. Edmund's execution would ruin the county. His plantation employs hundreds. It holds debts, contracts, obligations. Hanging him may satisfy scripture, but it will destroy livelihoods. Prosecutor Richard Fellows, thin, sharp, and unyielding, replied, "The law must be the same for all men. If we spare him because he is wealthy, we turn justice into a joke." Reverend Cartwright raised a shaking hand. "This is not merely legal, it is moral. What Hargrave has done is a sin that cannot be ignored. If we show mercy, we invite corruption into every household." Sheriff Dunor's voice cut through them all. "If you spare him, you tell every man in Bowford that the law applies only to the poor. I will not enforce a law that bends for wealth." Judge Middleton tapped the table. "There will be no hanging." Silence fell, not because they disagreed, but because they all knew what that meant. Whatever came next would be something Bowford had never seen before. Death, the judge continued, would be far too merciful. Mr. Hargrove must be punished in a way that ensures no one will ever dare follow his path. He outlined it calmly. 3 days in the pillory, 20 lashes each day, permanent scarring, forced to watch the 3 enslaved men be executed before his eyes. There was a collective intake of breath. Horror, approval, disbelief, fascination, all tangled together. The mayor whispered, "This will be monstrous." Middleton answered, "It must be." But somehow in ELS had he a plan. There was one person whose opinion had not yet been considered: Catherine. She was not invited to the meeting, but Bowford was a small town, and young Benjamin Porter, the judge's clerk, desperately in love with Catherine's cousin, overheard every detail and carried the entire plan straight to her. When Catherine heard the sentence, she felt something twist inside her. Edmund would live. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would die, and something about that cut deeper than she expected. They had been trapped in a world where obedience was survival. Edmund had been the one with the power. Edmund had been the one who summoned. Edmund had been the one who chose. And yet they would hang before he suffered. She could not allow that, not because she wanted to save them, but because she wanted Edmund to understand exactly what price he had made them pay. And she wanted the town to see the full breadth of his sin, not just the scandalous whisper of it, but the human cost. She requested a meeting with the judge. Catherine arrived at Judge Middleton's chambers dressed in mourning black, though no one had died yet. Her posture was rigid, her expression cool. "Your Honor," she said, "I have heard of your planned sentence." The judge's eyes narrowed. That discussion was private. "In Bowford, nothing is private for long," he exhaled. "What do you wish to say?" "I request," Catherine began softly, "that the punishment occur together." Middleton frowned. "Explain." She stepped forward. "I want Edmund in the pillory while Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel stand below him and watch. I want him to see their faces every hour of those 3 days. And on the final day after his last whipping, I want him conscious, fully conscious, when the gallows doors open beneath them. That," the judge whispered, "is extraordinarily cruel." "My husband showed me no mercy," she replied. "He destroyed my life in secret. I destroy his in the open." The judge studied her face, searching for hesitation. There was none. "Very well," he said at last. "The sentences will be combined." Catherine rose, smoothed her skirts, and gave a small, cold smile. "Justice should be whole, Your Honor. Not partial, not gentle. Whole." She left the chambers as quietly as she had entered. Judge Middleton sat alone for a long time afterward. He had expected the law to lead this case. He had not expected it to be led, at least in spirit, by a woman whose wrath was sharper than any blade. Begins Bowford's courthouse had never been so full. People climbed onto window ledges, packed against doorways, filled the aisles. Even the street outside pulsed with bodies pressing forward to hear the verdict of the most shocking case the county had ever seen. Edmund was led in wearing shackles. His once fine shirt was torn, his face gaunt, his eyes empty. The room went silent as he was seated. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought in moments later, chained together, forced to stand in the corner like shadows already half erased. When Catherine entered, whispering broke out across the room. Some saw a wounded wife. Some saw a calculating destroyer. All saw the woman who held the match that set fire to a dynasty. She took the stand. Her voice was steady as stone. She described the room, the pillows, the linens, the bodies, the sounds, the unmistakable way Edmund had touched and been touched. Men shifted in their seats, unable to reconcile the picture with the deacon they knew. Women turned pale behind their fans. No one breathed. When the prosecutor asked her if there was any possibility she had misunderstood, Catherine looked directly at Edmund and said, "No. What I witnessed was true, deliberate, and repeated. It was not madness. It was not confusion. It was who my husband chose to be." Edmund did not lift his eyes. The defense attempted a few weak questions. None mattered. The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes. They returned with 2 words that sealed 4 lives: guilty. All Judge Middleton rose, and with a heavy voice, he began to speak the sentences that would turn Bowford's town square into a theater of suffering unlike anything the Low Country had ever seen. The jury had barely taken their seats again when the murmurs began. A low, rising tide of voices rippling through the courtroom. Everyone knew the verdict before the foreman opened his mouth. Still, hearing it spoken aloud felt like a bell tolling over the whole of Bowford. Guilty all. Edmund Hargrove closed his eyes. Marcus stared straight ahead. Samuel's jaw tightened. Daniel trembled from head to toe, his tears already flowing before the judge even stood. When Judge Middleton rose, the room fell into a silence so complete it seemed unnatural, like the air had stopped moving. "THJG speakers Edmund Hargrove," the judge began, voice solemn. "You have been found guilty of the abominable crime of sodomy." No one moved. No one dared even shift their weight. "You have violated the laws of this state, the laws of God, and the sacred trust of your position as a Southern gentleman. You have corrupted the men under your authority and brought shame upon your family. your community, and your name." Edmund seemed to shrink at those words, not physically but inwardly. He had spent his entire life constructing a reputation as polished as Willowbrook's marble floors. With one sentence, that mirror shine shattered. Judge Middleton continued, "The law allows me to sentence you to death." A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. Some expected it. Others prayed for it. Death was clean. Death was swift. Death avoided spectacle. But, the judge said, raising his voice, "I believe death would be far too merciful." The entire room stiffened. Even Catherine lifted her chin slightly. She already knew what was coming, but hearing the official words mattered. "For 3 days," the judge declared, "you will be placed in the public pillory in Bowford's town square, from dawn until dusk." People gasped. Some covered their mouths. Some leaned forward hungrily. "At noon each day, you will receive 20 lashes with the whip. The punishment will leave permanent marks, so that for the rest of your life, you carry the evidence of your crime upon your body." Edmund swayed slightly in his restraints. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply stared ahead as if trying to hold on to whatever remained of himself. "And," the judge said, turning toward the corner where the 3 enslaved men stood in chains, "you will then witness the execution of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, whose lives your sins have destroyed." Daniel broke down completely. Samuel's hands clenched until the chains bit into his skin. Marcus's face went still with an expression Catherine could not read, sadness, pity, or some emotion too deep to name. The judge now addressed them. "You 3 are sentenced to death by hanging. Execution will occur in the town square on the 3rd day, after Mr. Hargrove's final punishment. He will be conscious and present to see each of you die." A ripple of horror moved through the room. Some people whispered, "Too cruel." Others whispered, "Not cruel enough." Teach FTSIC. When the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted. Some shouted that justice had been done. Others whispered prayers. Many simply stared, stunned, trying to absorb the sheer brutality of the sentence. Catherine rose and left without looking at Edmund, not once. She walked with the cold grace of a widow attending her own husband's funeral. To her, Edmund was already dead. Edmund remained seated as deputies came to take him away. His legs were weak, and they half lifted him to his feet. As they passed the 3 enslaved men, something flickered across his face, guilt, despair, a desperate longing to speak, but no words came. Marcus caught his eye. For a brief moment, just a second, their gazes locked. There was no hatred in Marcus's expression, no fear, only a quiet, devastating pity. That look broke something inside Edmund Hargrove that even the whip had not yet touched. The deputies led him out. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken separately, each man dragged toward a fate none of them had chosen. People spilled out of the courthouse, breathless with the news. By nightfall, everyone in the county knew the details: 3 days of torture, 3 slaves to hang, 1 man to watch them die. Parents forbid their children from even speaking of it. Teenagers whispered about sneaking off to watch. Merchants predicted the largest crowd Bowford would ever see. Church women insisted on prayer meetings. Tavern men demanded whiskey. Everyone felt something dark moving through the town, something older than the law and sharper than judgment. The hunger for spectacle. In the jail, Edmund lay on a thin cot, staring at the ceiling. He barely remembered being dragged into the cell. He remembered Catherine's voice echoing through his skull. "You are a sodomite. That is what you are. That is all you are." He felt the weight of every whip stroke before a single lash had been delivered. Down the hall, Samuel sat rigidly upright, jaw clenched until it hurt. Marcus murmured to Daniel, trying to keep him from collapsing completely. Daniel had not spoken since the sentence. His eyes were blank, drained of all hope. Outside, in the center of town, carpenters worked by lantern light. They built the pillory first, then the whipping post. Then, in the shadow of the courthouse, the gallows, 3 nooses hanging side by side, swaying in the humid night air. It was said that by the time the sun rose the next morning, nearly 300 people had already gathered, claiming spots with benches, chairs, baskets of food, as if preparing for a festival. But this would not be a festival. This would be a killing, slow for one man, swift for three. And no one, least of all Edmund, fully understood how much of himself he would lose before the week was over. The sun was about to rise on the first day of punishment, and Bowford was waiting. Dawn broke hot and merciless over Bowford on August 19, 1843. The air was thick even at sunrise, heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the faint sweetness of magnolia carried on a breeze too weak to bring comfort. By the time the church bell tolled 6, the town square was already swelling with bodies. Farmers, merchants, slaves brought by their masters to witness. Women clutching parasols, men standing with arms crossed, trying to appear stern rather than eager. Everyone wanted to see Edmund Hargrove fall. Everyone wanted proof that no man, not even a Hargrove, was untouchable. The pillory stood at the center of the square like a stage, polished wood gleaming in the morning light. Beside it, a thick, whipping post cast a long shadow, and farther back, rising above the restless crowd, 3 freshly tied nooses swayed gently from the gallows. This was not justice. This was theatre. And Bowford had come early for good seats. Birangiouchi mandu yitesantamane in amor. Just before 7, the jail doors opened. Deputies emerged, dragging Edmund Hargrove between them. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was not the man they remembered. Gone was the proud planter, the polished gentleman, the master of Willowbrook. What walked out into the square was a hollowed version of him, shoulders slumped, face drawn and pale, eyes unfocused. He wore only trousers. His bare chest was already trembling with fear, even though no lash had touched him yet. People did not whisper. They stared. And what Edmund felt then was a humiliation so complete it eclipsed pain. Every pair of eyes that had once glanced up at him with respect, every shopkeeper, every churchgoer, every farmer, was now a witness to his destruction. The deputies forced him into the pillory, lowering the heavy wooden frame over his neck and wrists. When it slammed shut, a sound echoed through the crowd like a muffled execution. Edmund flinched. The lock clicked. He would not leave that position until dusk. Theopimenge uarsof misiao. At first, the pain was simply physical, the strain on his shoulders, the awkward angle of his spine, the heat beating down on the back of his neck. But humiliation arrived faster. People approached in clusters, whispering and pointing. Some jeered openly. Some spat near his feet. Some looked at him with a twisted fascination, as if he were a creature in a cage rather than a man. His name, once spoken with respect, had become something dirty, a warning, a curse. Children kept at home by decent parents were replaced by teenagers who came anyway, drawn by the forbidden thrill of watching a man in chains. By mid-morning, flies swarmed around him, landing on his face, his hair, the sweat dripping down his neck. He could not lift his hands to swat them away. His back and legs began to shake from standing so long. His pride, once the strongest thing he carried, died in those hours. Theimuichi. Across the square, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought out in chains. They were forced to stand near the base of the pillory so Edmund could see them, and the spectators could see all 4 at once, the master and the slaves, united now by the same chains, the same doom. Marcus stood tall, expression unreadable. Samuel stared at Edmund with a cold, burning anger that had been waiting years for release. Daniel cried quietly, shoulders shaking, unable to stop himself. Their chains clanked whenever they shifted. They were made to watch. They were made to stand. They were made to wait for the sentence that hung over their heads. Literally. 3 nooses swinging in the breeze behind them. For the first time, Edmund saw them not as extensions of himself, not as silent shadows in his secret world, but as men. And that understanding hurt worse than the heat or the flies or the stares. At mid-morning, a hush fell across the square. Catherine Hargrove appeared at the edge of the crowd. She wore black again, a widow's black, though her husband still lived. 2 relatives from Charleston flanked her, their expressions tightly composed. She did not approach Edmund. She simply stood where he could see her, an unmoving figure beneath a dark parasol. Her posture was perfect, her chin lifted, her eyes icy and controlled. She did not flinch when Edmund's gaze found hers. She did not look away from his suffering. She wanted him to know she would witness every moment. This was her closure, her justice, her vengeance. And the crowd watched her almost as much as they watched him, trying to understand how a woman could contain so much cold resolve without breaking. No one theppping. When the courthouse clock struck 12, the sheriff stepped forward holding a long leather whip. The crowd fell absolutely silent. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were forced closer so they could see each blow. Edmund tensed. Edmund Hargrove, the sheriff announced, "By order of the court, you are to receive 20 lashes." He said it not with anger, but with the grim duty of a man who had done this before and would do it again. The first lash cracked through the air like lightning. It struck across Edmund's back with such force that the crowd flinched as one. Edmund gasped, sharp, immediate, but did not cry out. The second lash tore a thin line of red across his skin. The third broke him. He cried out, head jerking forward, body shaking uncontrollably. The crowd watched in transfixed horror. By lash 10, he was sobbing. By lash 15, his knees buckled, but the pillory held him upright, forcing him to endure each blow. Samuel's jaw clenched with satisfaction. Daniel wept harder. Marcus looked away, unable to watch the suffering of the man who had held so much of his life in his hands. When the 20th lash fell, Edmund's back was a canvas of blood and torn skin. The sheriff stepped back. Edmund sagged inside the wooden frame like a dead man propped up by ropes. But he did not die. The court had promised to keep him alive. Pain was part of his sentence. Suffering was required. After the whipping, the sun did its own brutal work. Flies crawled along his wounds, sweat mixed with blood. Every breath was agony. People continued to watch. Curiosity, disgust, fascination pulling them in even as decency told them to turn away. Some left with uneasy stomachs. Others stayed compelled by something darker. At times, Edmund drifted in and out of consciousness, only to be jolted awake by pain, or by another voice whispering, "That's the man who ruined himself," or "That's what sin looks like." When the sun finally dipped low on the horizon, Sheriff Dunor returned and unlocked the pillory. Edmund collapsed immediately, his legs unable to hold him. 2 deputies dragged him back to jail, leaving a faint trail of blood on the packed dirt. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were led away next, chains rattling in the dimming light. The day ended. But everyone knew the truth tomorrow would be worse. The second day of Edmund Hargrove's punishment dawned even hotter than the first. By sunrise, the air clung to the skin like wet cloth. The crowd was thinner at first. Some people had convinced themselves they wouldn't return, that what they'd seen yesterday was enough. But curiosity has a stronger pull than conscience, and by mid-morning, the square was full again. People needed to see if Edmund would survive another day. Some needed to see if he wouldn't. Brughdougain. When Edmund was brought from the jailhouse, there was a hush. His body was stiff, shaking with every step. What had once been proud posture was now bent and guarded, as though he were moving through invisible knives. His back was heavily bandaged, but even those bandages were stained. He did not lift his head. The deputies locked him back into the pillory. The wood pressed against fresh wounds beneath the cloth. He winced, a soft, broken sound escaping his throat, but he said nothing. The crowd watched him with something new, something uncomfortable. Yesterday had been spectacle. Today felt like witnessing a man unravel. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were positioned in front of him again. Each reacted differently. Marcus stood silent, arms trembling but face unreadable. Samuel was rigid, jaw clenched with a smoldering rage that had only grown. Daniel stared at Edmund with hollow eyes, as though grief had hollowed him out from the inside. They were chained, powerless, but the weight of the spectacle forced them to stand tall. When Catherine arrived, the crowd parted instinctively. She wore widow's black again, expression carved from marble. Some whispered she was heartless. Others said they would do worse if they had been humiliated as she had. A few admired her strength. She did not look at the 3 enslaved men, she looked only at Edmund. To her, this was not cruelty, it was closure. Teach soon estar. The heat rose relentlessly. Sweat dripped down Edmund's face. Flies swarmed. His legs trembled from exhaustion. Hours passed. The crowd watched as he wavered between consciousness and delirium. At one point he whispered something. Maybe a prayer, maybe a plea, maybe a name. No one could make it out. Marcus closed his eyes as if hearing it hurt him. Samuel turned away sharply. Daniel wept silently. Numen damen thecams began at noon. The sheriff approached again with the whip. The crowd seemed to stop breathing. Edmund tried to brace himself, but his body was beyond bracing. It was beyond resistance. 20 more lashes as sentenced by the court. The sheriff announced. The first strike brought a sound from Edmund that was nothing like yesterday. It was raw, unfiltered. The kind of cry that comes only when a person reaches their limit. He screamed from the first lash. He screamed from the second. By the 5th, his voice cracked. By the 10th, his knees buckled and he sagged against the wood, barely aware. Women turned away. Men shifted uncomfortably. Teenagers who had joked that morning now stood pale and silent. Some said the punishment was too harsh. Others muttered that the law was the law. But everyone knew the truth. Something inside Edmund Hargrove broke that noon. It wasn't just flesh, it was pride, identity, self. By the final lash, he was barely conscious, held upright only by wood and force of sentence. Even the sheriff looked shaken. The afternoon dragged on slower than the day before. People came and went, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or cruelty. Some whispered prayers, others whispered doubts. Marcus watched Edmund with an expression no one could decipher, some mix of sorrow and inevitability. Samuel's anger began shifting into something deeper, something tired. Daniel looked away completely. Catherine did not leave, but a rare flicker crossed her face. Was it satisfaction, doubt, regret? No one knew. Off day, TWO. When Edmund was finally released at sunset, he collapsed. Deputies carried him back to jail, careful only to avoid killing him. The doctor was ordered to ensure he lived through the night. The crowd dispersed slowly, quietly. They were no longer sure what they believed about justice. They were no longer sure what they believed about themselves. Because tomorrow, the final day would come, and tomorrow 3 nooses would tighten over 3 innocent men, and Edmund Hargrove would be forced to watch. August 21st, 1843, began with a strange stillness. The town square, usually loud with morning chatter, felt subdued, like a church before a funeral. More people arrived today than either of the previous days. Travelers from neighboring towns came on horseback just to witness the end of the scandal. Every bench, every porch step, every window was taken. People didn't come for justice. They came for closure. They came for the final act. They came to see how far a man could be destroyed. Fennel Welk, when the deputies brought Edmund out for the 3rd time, even the crowd's whispers faded. He was barely recognizable, his back wrapped in layers of cloth, his steps small and uneven, his head bowed so low it seemed he was trying to disappear. His face, once admired for its confidence, was swollen and vacant. Some gasped when they saw him. Some looked away. Some hardened their hearts. But everyone felt the same unspoken truth. The man being brought to the pillory was no longer the Edmund Hargrove they had known. He was a shell, a warning, a spectre wearing human form. The deputies locked him into the pillory for the last time. His body shuddered against the wood. He did not resist. He had nothing left to resist with. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought out made to stand beside the gallows. 3 nooses hung behind them, swaying slightly in the humid air. The enslaved population of Bowford gathered at the edges of the crowd, their faces tight with grief and fury. Everyone in the square knew the truth, whether they admitted it aloud or not. These 3 men were not criminals. But Bowford's laws did not belong to truth. They belonged to fear, control, hierarchy, and today they demanded payment. Marcus stood with quiet resolve. Samuel kept his chin high though his eyes burned. Daniel trembled so intensely that Marcus had to steady him with a touch on the shoulder. "No an lasti moody eng." When the sheriff announced the final 20 lashes, a murmur of discomfort passed through the crowd. Some were no longer sure they wanted to witness this, but everyone stayed. The first lash hit. Edmund didn't scream this time. He made no sound at all. Pain had moved beyond voice. By the 10th stroke, his head hung forward, limp. The doctor stepped closer, ensuring he remained conscious enough to see what would come next. The final lash fell. Edmund sagged in the pillory, breathing in small, broken gasps. But survival was not mercy. THEXEQTON at 2015, Judge Middleton arrived. He did not look at Edmund. He looked only at the 3 men standing on the gallows. Their final words would be remembered for generations. Daniel spoke first, his voice shaking. "If God sees this and does nothing, then I will not fear him." Samuel spoke next, louder. "You call this justice, but it is fear wearing a mask." Marcus looked at Edmund for the last time. His expression held sorrow, not anger, a sorrow that would haunt Edmund long after the rope snapped. The executioner pulled the lever. A single sound rippled through the square, a heavy wooden thud, and then silence. Bowford had killed them. 3 men who never had a choice. 3 men who carried the burden of another man's desires. 3 men who died because society demanded someone must pay. Edmund watched all of it. He watched the trapdoors fall. He watched the ropes go taut. He watched the stillness that followed. And something inside him tore open. Something deeper than flesh, deeper than identity. A sound escaped him, a small, broken wail of grief so raw that the closest spectators shivered. It was the moment Edmund finally understood what he had done. It was the moment he realized he would never escape the memory. Not in this life. Not in any. Tieci Ennis minute as the bodies hung for the customary hour, the crowd dispersed slowly, quietly. No cheers, no jeers. Only an H in the air, as though the town understood finally what it had participated in. Edmund was cut down from the pillory at sunset, barely alive, barely conscious, barely human. Judge Middleton visited him that night. "You have served your sentence," he said softly. "Leave Bowford. Leave South Carolina. Do not come back." Edmund nodded weakly. He had nowhere to return to. Willowbrook would be sold. His name would become a curse. His family would disown him. His life as Edmund Hargrove was over. 3 days later, he limped out of Bowford alone, a ghost of the man who once owned the land beneath his feet. Epilogue off. T.H.S. Catherine returned to Charleston. Willowbrook was auctioned. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were buried in unmarked graves. Bowford pretended life returned to normal, but it didn't. People pretended they hadn't felt something shift that week. A darkness inside themselves they didn't want to name. A truth they would spend decades trying to bury. But history always remembers, and some stories refuse to stay dead. For most people in Bowford, life seemed to resume its rhythm after the executions, at least on the surface. The markets reopened, church bells rang, children played in dusty streets. But beneath every conversation, beneath every polite greeting, beneath every prayer whispered on Sunday, something unsettled stirred. Because a town does not watch a man be broken and 3 innocent men be killed without carrying the weight of it. It becomes part of its soil, its memory, its shame. And no matter how hard Bowford tried to bury the scandal, it refused to stay dead. THCLE, OVLOW Willowbrook Plantation, 3,000 acres of wealth, prestige, and polished lies, went on the auction block within weeks of Edmund's departure. Buyers came from Charleston, Savannah, and even as far as Richmond. They saw the land, the mansion, the columns the carpentry Daniel had shaped with his own silent hands. But no one wanted the scandal. It clung to the house like humidity. It seeped into the walls. When a wealthy Charleston family finally purchased it, the first thing they did was change the name. They repainted walls, replaced curtains, removed portraits. They tried to erase every trace of the Hargrove lineage. But the enslaved people on the plantation remembered. They remembered Marcus, who spoke softly and carried burdens far heavier than any man should. They remembered Samuel, who never bowed his head except in defiance. They remembered Daniel, whose hands could shape wood, but not his own fate. Their names were whispered for years in the slave quarters, passed quietly from parent to child long after the masters pretended the scandal had faded. Catherine returned to Charleston with dignity draped around her like mourning silk. In polite society, she was treated as a tragic figure, a woman wronged by a husband corrupted beyond saving. She leaned into that role. It protected her. Over the years, she gained a reputation for intelligence, composure, and extraordinary discipline. She attended church without fail, hosted small gatherings, donated to charities that supported widows and orphans. But in the private solitude of her bedroom, sometimes late at night, something colder stirred. People claimed she never remarried because she had been betrayed once and feared being betrayed again. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that Catherine did not fear betrayal. She had mastered it. She had seen what she was capable of. She had witnessed the result, and perhaps a part of her feared that power. Those who knew her in her later years described her eyes as harder than they should have been, as if something inside her had calcified long before her body ever aged. Edmund Hargrove vanished into America. Some claimed he traveled west, toward Texas, where men reinvented themselves under new names. Others swore he died of fever within a year, alone in a shabby boarding house. A few whispered he joined the gold rush in '49, becoming one of thousands swallowed by the lawless frontier. But there was never proof. He faded from records, from newspapers, from memory. Only one undeniable truth remained. The Edmund Hargrove who once stood at the top of Southern society ceased to exist the moment the final lash struck, and the gallows opened beneath the men he had loved, used, or both. His punishment did not end in Bowford. It followed him like a shadow. A man can recover from wounds of flesh, but he cannot recover from the memory of being destroyed in front of an entire town. Generezu remembered. Though Bowford's white citizens spoke little of the scandal, the enslaved community remembered everything. They told the story of Marcus, the calm one, the thinker, of Samuel, the strong one, the fighter, of Daniel, the gentle one, the artist. Their names were repeated quietly at night, in songs, in whispers, in warnings to children. Never forget what power can do. Never forget how lies become chains. Never forget how truth can kill. Even after slavery ended, families in the region carried their memory. Some descendants learned pieces of the story from grandparents who had been children in 1843. Others heard only fragments: men hanged, innocent blood, a woman who started it all. But the core truth endured. 3 men died for a crime that was not theirs, and 1 man lived with it until the day he disappeared. Opening of records for decades. The official documents of the scandal, letters, transcripts, testimony, the sheriff's notes, remained locked away as ordered by Judge Middleton. Not for justice, for protection. Protection for the families, for the town, for the myth of Southern honor. In 1897, historian Thomas Bradford requested access. After heated debate, he was allowed to read them. He spent 3 months studying what Bowford had tried to erase. He wrote later that those 3 months changed him forever. When he published his findings in 1899, only scholars and clergy paid attention. Ordinary people did not want to revisit the darkness tucked under their grandparents' beds. But everything changed in 1923, when the county finally opened the files to the public. For the first time, the full truth was undeniable. Newspaper readers learned that the scandal had been more than personal sin. It had been a societal execution, a collective cruelty carried out in the name of morality. For others, a confirmation. For many, an embarrassment. Punt in 2015, Bowford's Historical Society erected a marker near the site of the 1843 gallows. It mentioned only the 3 enslaved men. Marcus, Samuel, Daniel. It called their deaths unjust. It acknowledged they had no ability to refuse their master. But the marker said nothing about Edmund, nothing about Catherine, nothing about the crowd of 347 who watched, nothing about the 3 days of sanctioned suffering, nothing about how a community used destruction as theater. History, it seemed, still preferred its stories simple. Victims, villains, lessons tied neatly in bronze. But the truth was never simple. Edmund was both victim and perpetrator. Catherine was both betrayed and destroyer. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were innocent, but punished as symbols. The town was horrified but complicit. No marker could capture that. No plaque could explain what it means when a society demands blood to redraw its boundaries. Tici Ichio Teens today, the square where the pillory once stood is quiet. Children run through it. Couples take photographs. Tourists pass by without knowing the ground beneath them once held suffering so intense it echoed for generations. But if you stand there long enough, when the wind is right and the streets are empty, some locals swear you can still feel something in the air, a heaviness, a hush, the weight of a story that refuses to stay buried. Because history does not disappear, it waits. It lingers in the soil, in the names no one speaks, in the unmarked graves at the edge of town. It lives on in the knowledge that cruelty wears many faces: righteousness, fear, law, love twisted into power. And if you listen closely, in that quiet square where the town once gathered to watch 4 men fall apart, you may hear the faintest echo of the question that still haunts Bowford: what would we have done?